This is Radio 4 FM. Over on Longwave now, the afternoon play is called Lobby Talk. But here on FM, we're going over live to Parliament, where James Naughtie is waiting to introduce this afternoon's Prime Minister's questions and the vote of no confidence debate in the House of Commons.
The scene outside the Palace of Westminster here tells the story of an extraordinary political drama. There are crowds down Whitehall and in Parliament Square. Ministers and Conservative MPs are huddled in groups and now engaged in a titanic leadership struggle. It is the succession that will put an end to the Thatcher years. This morning, after 11 years in power, the Prime Minister accepted that it was over. Now the next scene is about to unfold in the House of Commons itself, where Mrs Thatcher will take Prime Minister's questions and will respond to the opposition leader Neil Kinnock when he moves a motion of no confidence in Her Majesty's government. It will be a remarkable event. Mrs Thatcher will be rallying the party against the opposition, having accepted that its unity can only be restored with her departure. Like so much in the last 11 years, it will be a moment that will live in our history. We're going to the chamber of the House of Commons now, and John Foster. John, what is the timetable this afternoon?
Well, Jim, Prime Minister's questions will start in around about 10 or 12 minutes' time at 3:15. After Prime Minister's questions are over, there'll be a statement from the Defence Secretary, Tom King, about the Gulf crisis, in which he's expected to announce that more British troops will be joining the forces already in the region. There'll be questions on that statement. They usually last for at least half an hour, though today MPs may be impatient to get on with the main debate. Then, after that statement, there's yet another statement that's on what the House of Commons will be doing over the next week, and that'll be made by the Leader of the House, John McGregor, who, you remember, stood in for Mrs Thatcher at Prime Minister's questions earlier in the week. Again, normally we'd expect that to last for 30 or 40 minutes, but again today it may perhaps be a little bit shorter. After the statements are over, any points of order will be taken by the Speaker before we move on then, finally, to the main debate, the motion of no confidence, which will be proposed by the Labour leader, Neil Kinnock. So, therefore, we would expect Mr Kinnock to be standing up sometime between about 4:30 and 5 o'clock.
And then Mrs Thatcher responds to Mr Kinnock's opening speech.
That's right, yes. We probably expect each speech to be something of the order of about half an hour.
For the moment, John Foster, thank you very much. And now, John Harrison, our chief political correspondent. John, it has been one of the most remarkable days in modern British politics. We now have an extraordinary leadership struggle in the Conservative Party. What is the mood now, 5-6 hours after the announcement that Mrs Thatcher is to go?
I think in one sense, once they recover from the numbness of the past 2 or 3 days, there's going to be a sense of relief that, in a sense, it's now an open fight between three candidates. Mrs Thatcher, who was clearly the problem for so many backbench Conservatives, indeed so many members of her own cabinet, will be going once the succession is complete. And I think to that extent, some relief, because now they will look forward to A, a new leader, B, the prospects of perhaps new priorities in policy, perhaps even a cabinet reshuffle, and then I think they will want very eagerly to turn towards the next general election. So for the moment, obviously a shock, tension, some expectation about who succeeds, but beyond that, some relief that they're beginning to see their way through to getting back to taking on the Labour Party.
John Harrison, thank you very much. Out here, outside the Palace of Westminster, I'm joined by three senior figures. Cecil Parkinson, Transport Secretary, old colleague of Mrs Thatcher's, David Owen, and Tony Blair from Labour's Shadow Cabinet. First of all, Cecil Parkinson, clearly an emotional day for you as you bid farewell, in effect, to Mrs Thatcher.
Yes, it was an emotional day and a draining sort of day. And although one had seen the situation develop overnight, it was still quite a shock when it happened.
Who is going to win? The Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd, the Chancellor John Major, and Michael Heseltine, who of course precipitated this event, are locked together for the next 5 days. Is it easy to predict the outcome?
Not for me. I actually haven't given it a thought until a relatively short time ago, because I'd been working very hard to persuade Mrs Thatcher to stay and to persuade people that she should. And I hadn't really thought very much about the alternative, and I'm just starting to think about it now.
David Owen, what have you been thinking today since you learned that Mrs Thatcher had finally accepted what became inevitable?
Well, she's an old adversary. We've been locked together in particularly the last two general elections, but I certainly feel sad. She has been a formidable Prime Minister. She's certainly going to be one of the great Prime Ministers of this century. She's been toppled. I think, frankly, she toppled herself. It was hubris, the old Greek overconfidence, and I think that she almost invited Geoffrey Howe to sink her with his broadside, and it was that below the water shot which has led to her leaving. But I look now to the Conservative elections. It's up to them which one they choose, but I think they've got a reasonable choice.
Tony Blair, Labour's employment spokesman, what is the effect of this on the Labour Party?
I think probably it makes us even keener in the preparations we've got for government, and I say that because I think the Conservative Party have behaved in the most extraordinary fashion over the past couple of weeks. I would have thought the wounds are very, very deep indeed, and I also think there is a new agenda emerging for the 1990s, a new spirit of the times, and I think Labour exemplifies that.
It is clear, surely, that the Conservative Party will give Mrs Thatcher a great welcome when she arrives in the House of Commons this afternoon. A great deal hangs on Neil Kinnock's speech, doesn't it?
I think it's obviously a very important speech, and I think that what he will be concentrating on is not the personality of the Prime Minister at all, but the policies of the government, and saying that the policies of the government are what has been wrong.
Cecil Parkinson, does this make it easier or more difficult for the Conservatives to win the next election?
Well, I think that obviously we've got to choose a leader. We've got to unite behind the leader. I do happen to think that Neil Kinnock's made a major howler in going for a censure vote today. The party's been absolutely looking for a reason to demonstrate, an opportunity to demonstrate that although we may have internal differences, which we will get settled, we're totally united in our opposition to the Labour Party. And this gives us a very good opportunity to show that. So we're pleased that Neil Kinnock's given us that chance.
Doesn't this mean that there's going to be an earlier election than perhaps we thought?
I personally wouldn't have thought so, no. I still think that when we get this out of the way, the election will be won or lost on the economic arguments, and I think we'll be in a good position the longer we wait to win that argument.
We're going over to the chamber now, and John Foster.
Tory MPs on their feet, waving their order papers as the Prime Minister comes in to take her seat. Enormously crowded chamber here this afternoon. This is what MPs have been waiting for. Several MPs pointing and shouting from the Labour side. Speaker on his feet, attempting to restore order, attempting to encourage MPs to continue with questions on Northern Ireland.
Unseemly indeed. That's unseemly. Mr. Rybanks, can he give assurance?
So the Speaker insisting that questions on Northern Ireland matters should continue. This chamber absolutely crowded with MPs here, standing in the aisles, standing in the front of the Speaker, at the other end of the chamber. More MPs arriving all the time.
Any feelings of remorse for the remarks attributed to him regarding the Prime Minister in view of her dignified resignation?
So with Richard Needham answering questions here on matters relating to Northern Ireland, another 3 or 4 minutes yet before Mrs Thatcher will be at the dispatch box. Let's go back now to Jim Naughtie.
Back here with our politicians, David Owen, what's your view looking ahead to the election? Isn't it the case that if a new Conservative leader is elected and duly rallies the party, there will probably be a short honeymoon which can be taken advantage of?
Yes, I think they'll go for an early election. I think they'll go when inflation comes down, which it definitely will, in the spring, early summer, mortgages start coming down, and a new Prime Minister calls, quite legitimately, as indeed did Anthony Eden, for a fresh mandate. My own feeling is that Neil Kinnock would have been wiser actually to have pulled off this censure debate now that today has happened. I don't think it's going to produce anything at all. The crucial question now is who do the Conservatives choose? If they're wise, in my judgment, they'll choose John Major.
Will you stand in that election?
Ha 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 ha.
We're not going to get an answer to that.
I know we're having a good old joke, but I'm not a Tory.
All right, Tony Blair, do you think John Major will be chosen?
I haven't the faintest idea, and it's obviously not what concerns us. I mean, what we're trying to do in the debate today, obviously, is address the interests of the country. What has happened in the Conservative Party is extraordinary, but politics is not a spectator sport. the country's expecting the Labour Party to set out an agenda for the 1990s to say why the Conservative Party as a government, as a party in government, is wrong.
But you've been arguing, of course, that Mrs. Thatcher has precipitated divisions on Europe, on economic policy, on the poll tax. In that sense, isn't today's event going to help bring about the sort of changes that you've been arguing for?
Well, these divisions surely remain. I mean, what I would like to know is if Mrs. Thatcher's policies are correct, then why is she gone? And if they're not correct, then let us be told exactly where those policies are wrong. Are they wrong on the poll tax, on the health service, on the economy, on education and training? And that's why I think these divisions are very, very deep. There was a battle not between personalities, but a battle between factions.
Cecil Parkinson, will Mrs. Thatcher be able to claim, after the extraordinary events of the last few weeks, when she rises to her feet in the Commons this afternoon, that the government's united on policy?
I think she could be quite justified in saying that if you look at the statements that various candidates have made and the criticisms Jeffrey made, there is very little difference on policy. Basically, I mean, my own view is that the election, Michael Heseltine threw his hat into the ring, not because of any great difference in policy, but because the Prime Minister had the job that he wanted, and he didn't like her. And so he decided he was going to try and topple her. And I think he spent the whole of his time since he declared his explaining that he'd be just as tough on Europe, that he's not a federalist, that he doesn't believe in imposed single currency, that he doesn't want the Bundesbank to run our economy. Well, it's a very puzzling sort of distinction.
David Owen, just without picking up some of the points there that Cecil Parkinson made, let's look forward to the scene that's about to unfold in the House of Commons. What's it going to be like? It's going to be one of the most dramatic days any of us have seen in recent times, isn't it?
It's going to be a total anticlimax. She's shot Neil Kinnock's fox. I mean, she was going to be standing at bay as the Prime Minister, who was under great attack, who had her authority dented very considerably. And now she stands as the Prime Minister who has stood down, who is takingly defending the Tory party, and she's going to have a good innings. It can't be anything other than
And Tony Blair, as a member of Neil Kinnock's shadow cabinet, what do you want to see from him this afternoon?
I want to see the policies of the government taken apart, it being said why we are in such a mess, both in economic and social terms, why the government's failed to prepare for the long term, and why we should have a Labour government.
Tony Blair, David Owen, Cecil Parkinson, thank you all. Now from the tumult outside the Palace of Westminster, where crowds are gathering in the expectation that history is in the making, we go to the chamber itself and John Foster.
Thank you, Jim, and indeed tumult inside the chamber as well. The Prime Minister herself arrived just a few minutes ago, as you may have heard, to a rapturous reception from Tory MPs who stood cheering, waving their order papers. She'll be answering questions in just a few moments' time, questions which will be listened to not just here in the chamber, of course, but indeed throughout the world. Indeed, we are now joined by listeners from the World Service who will be wanting to hear what is going on, how the Prime Minister defends herself, what is being said in this remarkable parliamentary occasion. Traditionally, MPs table a question to the Prime Minister asking her to list her engagements today, and that allows them, of course, to raise any subject in their supplementary which is of particular relevance to her engagements. Well, of course, ironically, today, Mrs. Thatcher's own engagements are the matter of the most important public interest. Ironically, though, the first question is not about her engagement, and it's more specific than usual. It comes from an Ulster Unionist, the Reverend Martin Smith, who wants to know when she will next be visiting Belfast South. But subsequent to that, there will be other MPs who will be asking questions about what she is doing, including Tony Marlow, who is one of those who has been moving for her to resign, and he in fact has the second question. The chamber absolutely packed, of course. On the front bench beside Mrs. Thatcher, all members of her cabinet. Sitting beside her, in fact, John Wakeham, who would have masterminded her campaign had she gone through to the second ballot. Other prominent cabinet ministers ranged beside Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Wakeham on the front bench. At the dispatch box at present, one of the junior Northern Ireland ministers is answering questions on Northern Ireland matters, which are due to come to an end any moment now, before the Speaker will call the Prime Minister for this remarkable session of question time. Not, in fact, likely to be her last session of Prime Minister's questions, because the timetable of the leadership ballot means that she could indeed be answering questions at least 3, possibly 4 more times. But now Mrs. Thatcher called to the dispatch box for that first question. When will she next visit Belfast South? Mrs. Thatcher.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I had a very successful visit to Northern Ireland on the 16th of November, but have no plans to visit the honourable member's constituency in the immediate future.
Now the Reverend Martin Smith with his supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, you will understand that Ulster Unionist members will have empathy today with the Prime Minister because we know what betrayal means. Can I assure her, if she visits South Belfast, she will discover amongst the majority of my constituents sympathy for her views on Europe. For having suffered from centralised bureaucracy, we do not wish to have Brussels bureaucracy.
Mr. Speaker, I will hope to visit the province many times in the future, perhaps in a slightly different capacity, and might then come to visit the Honourable Gentleman's constituency. With regard to our policy on Europe, I believe it is one which appeals to most people in this country, and I believe it is right.
Mr. Tony Marlow.
This is the next question. This is Tony Marlowe's question of what Mrs. Thatcher is doing today.
Number 2.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I chaired a meeting of the Cabinet. At 1:45 I had an audience of Her Majesty the Queen. Later this afternoon I shall lead for the government against the motion put down in the name of the Leader of the Opposition.
Tony Marlowe with his supplementary question.
My right honourable friend, accept
Order.
Would my right honourable friend, except from those of us on this side, who share her objectives, whatever our roles may have been in recent weeks, that this is a day, this is a time of sadness and happiness. Sadness for her from the great well of affection that exists throughout the House. Happiness in celebration of what has been, is, and will remain the greatest peacetime political reign of this century. And a day of dedication to sustain and build on the massive achievements of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher.
Mr. Speaker, may I thank my honourable friend. The same person in a slightly different capacity will be available to serve Britain in whatsoever way it happens.
Mr. Speaker, may I pay tribute to the Prime Minister and to her decision this morning. She showed by that she amounts to more than those who have turned upon her in recent days. Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady, I know, considers the principle of choice to be extremely important, and that is rightly so. Does she agree with me that the people of Britain should now be given the power of choice in a general election?
Mr. Speaker, may I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his earlier comments. In reply to his later question, the answer is no. No more than we had an election when Mr. Wilson changed to Mr. Callaghan.
Mr. Churchill.
Is
Winston Churchill, now Conservative.
friend aware that she deserves the gratitude of the entire nation for her part in bringing to an end the Soviet part in the arms race and burying once and for all the Cold War between the superpowers. It is in that capacity that she will be remembered as the greatest peacetime Prime Minister this country has ever had.
I'm grateful to my honourable friends, both for his staunchness in defence and for his remarks. It was a great privilege to attend the CSCE conference in Paris and to sign some of the disarmament agreements, and for the new CSCE, which really ushers in a new order in Europe, and I hope a very successful, peaceful one.
Mr. Ashdown.
Paddy Ashdown now, the leader of the Liberal Democrats.
That many of us recognise that she had to take a very tough decision this morning, and we believe she took the right decision and took it with great dignity. May I also say to her that however wide our political divisions, and they are of course very wide, no one can doubt the special style she's brought to that dispatch box, nor her courage, conviction and determination that she has brought to her premiership. Mr. Speaker, perhaps I might ask her to use this opportunity to offer to the House any advice she might have for a successor.
Mr. Speaker, apart from the last bit, may I thank the right honourable gentleman for his kindness. May I remind the House that I expect to be here on Tuesday afternoon and possibly even on Thursday afternoon.
That will depend on the outcome of the round 2 ballot.
So I hope the House will be as kind then as it is today.
Mr. Teddy Taylor.
Teddy Taylor, Conservative. This next question, this is about a meeting of the European Council about agricultural reform.
The government has played a central role in supporting the European Commission's proposals and enabling the community to table its offer at the GATT talks in Geneva.
Mr. Taylor.
Teddy Taylor, Conservative prominent supporter of Mrs. Thatcher.
In Britain and throughout Europe could be seriously affected by an international trade war unless the EEC produces a meaningful reform of the absurdly and costly CAP. Would she remind the bright chaps who are now standing for election that the average cost per household of the CAP is now £5.20 per week more than the total net cost of poll tax per household? And would she finally accept the good wishes and the gratitude of all Southend East Conservatives for the fantastic job she's done for common sense, for freedom and for democracy?
Mr. Speaker, I very much agree with my honourable friend. Jobs and prosperity depend upon getting freer trade, and we played a prominent part in that recently at the last the European Council and in getting proposals tabled to GATT. I will, of course, respond to my honourable friend's invitation of reminding my colleagues who stand for election, but let me say this to him. I shall remind them whether they're standing for election or not.
Dr. Godman.
Norman Godman, Labour.
Agree with me that it is absolutely essential with regard to the decisions taken at that meeting that our hill farmers be given the protection that they so manifestly deserve. And would she also agree with me, given the assurances that she has given to me in the past, that there is a very serious warning in that decision, in those decisions, for our fishermen, vis-à-vis the changes that the Spanish and others would like to inflict upon the common fisheries policy? If she is not to be here to defend our fishermen, will she urge upon her successor that they too are worthy of our defence?
Mr. Speaker, I think for once I can agree with the honourable gentleman. Our hill farmers are absolutely vital to the health of those areas and to the health structure of those areas, and we have therefore tried to increase the grants available to them because we recognise their importance not only to farming but to the rural areas. With regard to the fisheries question, it has always been one of the most difficult in the community, and so far we've got a pretty good deal for our fishermen. We shall continue to try to do so, but as he knows, there is this vital question of the fishing boats pending, and many people will be very happy when that is resolved, preferably to our own advantage.
Damon Lane, Kellett Bowman.
Will my right
Conservative.
Accept from me the love and affection of millions of people in my part of the world who have looked to her over these years with the greatest admiration and delight.
Yes. I'm particularly grateful to receive that from my honourable friend. We were at college together, and I think have been together ever since.
Mr. Greville Janner.
This is the next question from a Labour MP, Greville Janner, asking Mrs. Thatcher's engagements.
The gentleman to reply if he's asked the question. I refer the honourable gentleman to the reply that I gave some moments ago.
Mr. Greville Janner.
Greville Janner, Labour MP, with this supplementary.
To thank the Prime Minister for many personal kindnesses which she has given over many years to backbenchers on both sides of the House. And may I at the same time say how deeply concerned my constituents are that she has left the place in such a shambles. Is she aware that they are desperately worried about poll tax, about the deepening recession, about the health service? They are worried about the educational system and about the whole Tory shambles. Will the Prime Minister indicate who she thinks should take a share in the blame for what is, after all, a Conservative mess.
Well, the honourable gentleman always was quite a good advocate. He could speak to any brief, and I don't believe he believed a word of that.
Conservative MPs waving their order papers at that. Sir John Stokes now, another prominent supporter of Mrs. Thatcher.
Does my right honourable friend, Sir John Stokes, does my right honourable friend not agree that the age of chivalry is gone and has been succeeded by those of economists and calculators? Does she further not look back with pride and satisfaction at all those years when she's leader of this country and the world statesman?
I think, Mr. Speaker, the age of chivalry will not have gone so long as my honourable friend is a member of this House. And yes, in response to his question, I do look back with some pride and some satisfaction at our achievements for our country over the last 11 and a half years.
To Ken McGuinness.
And this is the next question from Ken McGuinness, Ulster Unionist MP. Again asking what Mrs. Thatcher was doing for the day. Mr. McGuinness with his supplementary.
The gratitude of my constituents for her visit last Friday to Inniskillen and their admiration for her courage as she visited the frontier post at Derryad, where sadly 2 of our soldiers were killed a short time ago. How is she convinced of the need to maintain such permanent patrol bases for the welfare of the community, and the foolishness that it would be to remove them or company patrol bases and thus surrender more territory to the terrorists?
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. Those vehicle crossing checkpoints are obviously very important to the confidence of the people who live in the area, but that one was an example of the dangers to the army who manned them. And clearly, as the honourable gentleman knows, we are taking every possible precaution to learn the lessons from that attack. And I can only say that as I went round on the border areas, one can only once again be very impressed by the courage and bravery of both our soldiers and our policemen who work in those areas.
Mr. Jonathan Aitken.
Jonathan Aitken, Conservative.
My honourable friend considered that the voice of a great former Prime Minister could be extremely influential on great issues of state, such as our future role in Europe. Will she assure her many friends in the House and the country that she will continue to champion, that she will...
Labour MPs laughing and pointing at Ted Heath, who is also in the chamber today.
Mr. Aitken!
My question, Mr. Speaker, was directed to a great former Prime Minister. Will she assure her many friends in the House and the country that she will continue to champion the causes for which she has fought so valiantly? And will she continue to raise her voice in favour of a referendum on some of the great constitutional issues that may confront us?
Mr. Speaker, what my honourable friend says had in fact secretly occurred to me, that one's voice might be listened to after. I believe we now have a policy for the future of Europe behind which we can all unite. And I believe that many, many people in other countries in Europe believe in a Europe of nation states and in cooperation between those nations.
Statement, Mr. Secretary King.
So, the Speaker calling an end to this remarkable session of Prime Minister's Question Time. An occasion when, despite an absolutely packed House, MPs have been remarkably quiet during the questioning of Mrs. Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher answering in measured tones. Now we have a statement from the Defence Secretary, Tom King, on the Gulf.
and has continued to defy the United Nations demand to withdraw. Sanctions have left Iraq increasingly isolated. The Royal Navy has played an important part in this embargo. But Saddam Hussein shows no sign yet of complying with UN resolutions and ending his barbaric treatment of the Kuwaiti people and the hostages he has detained illegally. Moreover, there are now over 400,000 Iraqi troops in and near Kuwait. It remains the government's firm objective to resolve this crisis as soon as possible.
Now, we go to John Harrison, our chief political correspondent, who was watching Mrs. Thatcher in one of her last performances at Prime Minister's Question Time. John, Mrs. Thatcher sounded extraordinarily confident, perhaps even relaxed. Did you sense a little bit of relief underneath all the horror she's had to endure the last 2 or 3 days?
I think that's right. Relief is a good word, but I would put it stronger than that. I think we saw a Prime Minister who was calm, was confident, performed with great dignity, smiled when there were jokes, resisted some of the jibes from some opposition members of Parliament, and I think demonstrated what skill she is capable of producing at the dispatch box. It surely must have been quite an ordeal to have turned up this afternoon, having gone through, as you say, the trauma of the past 2 or 3 days, and to conduct Prime Minister's questions. But she was confident. She quite pointedly dressed in blue. She made no apology for her policy on Europe. She said no to Mr. Kinnock when he was pressing her on whether or not there should be a general election. It was the kind of performance we frankly have come to expect from a Prime Minister whose resilience has been put to the test before and whose resilience has in fact carried her through, though clearly in terms of surviving as a leader, not resilient enough.
It was a pretty emotional occasion, John, and of course Mrs. Thatcher was given a tremendous welcome by her own side, and indeed a generous welcome from the other side. There seemed to be some irritation when Tony Marlow, as a prominent supporter of Mr. Heseltine, paid tribute to her.
Yes, bearing in mind that Mr. Marlow, who's on the right of the Conservative Party, was among the first and most outspoken to demand that she should stand down. So the moment he rose to his feet and referred to her as my right honourable friend, of course, what friend demands that you stand down? There were cries of Judas from some quarters, and clearly Mr. Marlow had some difficulty getting his point across. It didn't help, I suspect, that he talked about the twin emotions of sadness and happiness. Whose sadness, whose happiness? And it was an altogether awkward intervention by him.
The emotion was running high. It seemed to me that Teddy Taylor and Elaine Kellett-Bowman, particularly, seemed to be almost in tears as they paid tribute to their friend and Prime Minister.
Yes, Elaine Kellett-Bowman certainly was very emotional. It was that kind of an exchange over 15 minutes, and I think the fact that Mr. Kinnock pitched his remarks in the way he did, by acknowledging how difficult a decision it must have been for her and the way in which she carried it out. I think he used the word dignity. All that added to the moment. It's been striking how when Paddy Ashdown followed up with similar words, he couldn't resist trying to get into the politics of it all and tempted her to suggest who might succeed her, a temptation she resisted.
John Harrison, for the moment, thank you very much. I'm joined here outside the Palace of Westminster by 3 distinguished party figures, by Bill Cash of the Bruges Group on the Conservative side, by Jim Wallace, the Liberal Democrat Chief Whip, and first of all by the Arts Minister, David Mellor. David Mellor, what did you make of Mrs. Thatcher's performance there? It was an extraordinarily typical, dogged and rather remarkable performance, wasn't it?
Yes, it was a very remarkable performance. The Prime Minister was totally in control of herself in a way that I think few of us would have been capable of being, and I think showed the qualities that will make her one of Britain's greatest ever Prime Ministers.
You have already, I think, declared your support for the Chancellor of the Exchequer, John Major. Do you think he is going to be the next Prime Minister?
Yes, I do. I hope so. May I say straight away that I hope this will be one of those elections where we can speak with respect and affection for all of those who are standing. That is my position. I have nothing against any of the 3 candidates, and I'm not doing what I'm doing to spike the guns of any one of them. I would serve happily under any of them. And that's a genuine tribute, not a weasel-worded political reply. But I do think that John Major has particular qualities to bring to bear. I've known him as a close friend for 10 years. I think in terms of his political experience and his personal characteristics, he is absolutely right for this job. And I also think, I'm bound to tell you, that I think that so far as the future is concerned, our primary concern is going to have to be to unite the nation. And I can't help feeling that as far as uniting the nation behind the government, John Major will do a good job at that.
When you talk about the party unifying as a result of this leadership election, isn't the problem this, that the point about a leadership election is that the issues have to be argued out, the different approaches have to be judged by the Conservative MPs here, and therefore isn't it inevitable and indeed proper that there should be a pretty fierce argument over the next few days?
Well, I think that there will be discussions. I don't think we want fierce arguments. I think what we want is people, in a basis of mutual respect, people are going to have to work together, who will work together, who have indeed agreed amongst themselves. I'm quite confident that they will work together. They've got to argue it through. And I come back to the point. I think John Major will be the best person able to unite the party because he has a flood of support from across the board. I mean, already over 100 members of Parliament have got in touch with John Major's office from across the party saying they wish to support him, and I think that will grow and build, and I think John Major has all of the personal qualities that will be needed for that. But I don't think anyone wants to get into a fierce argument about that. It's just a question of saying, faced with the choice, none of us can afford to sit on the fence. We've got to plunge in, and I plunge in favour of John for those reasons.
David Mellor, thank you very much. Bill Cash, Mrs Thatcher there in question time talked about Europe almost inevitably, which has been so much a part of what has happened this morning. You must be rather distressed, sitting in the Bruges Group, taking a hard line on Europe to see the end of Mrs Thatcher, quite apart from your personal feelings.
Well, obviously I regard her departure as a severe tragedy for the nation. She has been one of the greatest prime ministers we've ever had. And she staked out the ground for those of us who know what's really going on extremely clearly. I mean, only yesterday, the Prime Minister of Italy, Andreotti, said we are going to have a federal Europe. And I mean, the fact is, everybody ought to have known it. I've been saying so for 5 years. And I think that there has been a great deal of misinformation put around to the other effect.
Now, where do people who take your view on Europe, a robust Thatcherite view, if I can use that phrase, turn in this leadership contest? To John Major?
Very simply, we want to have a very clear explanation from the contenders as to exactly where they do stand. The circumstances which prevailed before this regrettable incident occurred with the departure of the Prime Minister was bedeviled by a language problem, which was, we will argue for, or we will not have it imposed, ? Are we going to agree to it? For example, are we in fact going to find that we agree to a date of 1994 without having a piece of paper presented to us and still go along with it? Again, we are, they will say, accepting goals accepted by Parliament, when in fact there is a necessity for treaty amendments, so that there is a lot of confusion which needs to be cleared up.
Thank you, Bill Cash. We're going back to John Foster in the chamber where Mr Heseltine has arrived.
Mr Heseltine, in fact, is trying to intervene in the statement on the Gulf, and the Speaker is on his feet just at present. A number of MPs are trying to ask questions about the announcement that the Defence Secretary Tom King has made about extra British troops for the Gulf. Among those who has arrived in the chamber, as I say, Michael Heseltine, Prime Minister, is still here. And the Speaker is quite likely to call Mr Heseltine, as he is, of course, a former Defence Secretary.